Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Upper House on this cold November morning. I hope that you've gotten that wonderful full breakfast, maybe our cup of coffee, and are just excited to be here this morning. My name is Melissa Shackelford, and I serve as the Director of Program Curation and Community Impact here. And we're so grateful to be hosting this morning's conversation. As a center for Christian gathering and learning, Upper House is honored to come alongside the work of the local church to support, resource, and champion pastors, ministry leaders, and their congregations. We also value gathering pastors and congregants from a variety of different Christian traditions to champion a healthy, thriving, and connected church in the Madison area. This morning is no exception as we discuss the major shifts occurring in the American church and seek to address these trends together. We will hear from Bob Smietana, Christopher James, and Carrie Parker this morning, all of whom want to welcome you into a larger conversation during the Q&A about how these trends are playing out here locally and what call we might be discerning here in Madison regarding the future of the church. Inspiring today's conversation is the recent release of veteran religion writer Bob Smietana's book entitled Reorganized Religion, The Reshaping of the American Church and Why It Matters. We will start out our program with an interview with Bob, facilitated by my colleague Daniel Hummel, who is the Director of University Engagement here at Upper House and a historian of American religion, whose writings have appeared in the Washington Post, Christianity Today, and Religion News Service. Let me also say a few more formal words about Bob before we welcome them both to the stage. Bob Smietana is an award-winning reporter and Pulitzer grantee who has become one of the most respected and well-known religion reporters in the country, with more than 2 decades of experience in covering religion, spirituality, and ethics. He has served as a senior writer for Facts and Trends, senior editor of Christianity Today, and the religion writer at the Tennessean. He is currently a national reporter for Religion News Service, where his wire service stories, which attract wide readership from lay people, pastors, and scholars, have appeared in both secular and religious publications, such as the Washington Post, USA Today, Christianity Today, and the Associated Press. Please join me in welcoming both Bob and Dan to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. Bob, thanks for being here with us, and we're happy to celebrate your new book.
I'm glad to be here. I do have a sad part. I should have put in my bio that I am best known for writing about an apocalyptic end-time cat worshippers in Nashville. And the name of that story was called Apocalypse Meow. If you ever want to hear about it. But I wish I should have put that in the bio. It sounds so much better.
I assigned the text to my students.
Oh, you should. Great. I love that story so much.
Excellent. We're already off to an unplanned start, so that's great. Apocalypse Meow was not planning on that today.
We didn't talk about that yesterday.
That's right. Yeah. Bob and I had the pleasure yesterday of having a podcast interview that'll be coming out in a few weeks where we get into Bob's biography, why he became a reporter, what he's learned from that time. Today we'll be talking about his book, Reorganized Religion, and this is a 25-minute interview really to get a conversation going. So this is not going to cover all the arguments or all the stories in the book, not even close. But we are going to, I'm going to ask Bob just a few questions that do reflect the structure of the book. So the book is in 3 parts. Part 1 is where we stand. Part 2 is why people are leaving. And part 3 is where do we go from here. So I'm going to turn that into a set of questions that get us thinking about the sort of current moment and future of religion in the U.S. So Bob, I thought I'd start with asking you just what are 2 or 3 trends that define our current church moment?
So that's a hard question to answer because there's about 15 trends, but I'm gonna cut it to 3. So the first one, there 3 are basically unrelenting change. The second one is polarization, and the third would be decline. Okay, so the unrelenting changes. So I was born in 1965. When I was born, 85% of the country was white. Almost everybody was Christian, and almost everybody was Protestant. Most people were Protestant. The men were in charge. The nuclear family was the center of life. And going to church is what good people did. And the society looked at churches and said, oh, if we need to know what's right and good in the world, we'll ask the church people. So I'm about to become a granddad, and our granddaughter, we know it's a granddaughter, we don't know her name because my daughter's being secretive about it. But she has a nickname, Paprika. So if you ever saw Blue's Clues or Salt, Pepper, Paprika, so when little Paprika is born, she'll be born into a generation of people where there's no ethnic majority. She'll be born into a multi-ethnic, pluralistic, becoming egalitarian world. It's not there yet, but it's going to become more egalitarian. That's LGBT affirming, where we redefine what families are, where people don't go to church and they don't think churches are important. So that's all changed, right? So that part of the world changed. Plus, we changed the economy, we changed politics, we changed the way we relate socially. We've changed everything. So the entire universe has changed, at least in the country, the social universe that we live in. The problem with churches is they were made for that old world. And they exist in that old world, and that world is disappearing. And sometimes churches, when I'll talk a little bit about decline, they think this is our fault. It's our pastor's fault. It's our theology's fault. We did bad things. You might have done all those things. It doesn't matter. The world changed, and that's why you face the challenges that you do. And that's why people have to adapt, because there's no going back to the old world. So that's one. So the second one is polarization. And there's a great term I learned this last year called affective polarization. And it's related to the big sword. Does everybody know what the big sword is? Because I was talking to some people about this. They're like, what is that? Anybody know big sword? Yeah. So there's a book called The Big Sword. Basically, Americans have sorted themselves into kind of what they call stacking identities. So that people live next to and socialize with people who look like them, who think like them, who vote like them, who have the same consumer choices like them. And they've stacked these things to make an identity. So if you tell me where you go to church, I can probably tell you how to vote, how you voted. Not with, it's not like I can read your mind, but I can tell because of these identities. So in a world like that, the way to get anything done is to tell people who the bad guys are and who's to blame. So if you look at American, actually public polling on difficult issues in America, abortion, same-sex marriage, immigration, how to deal with racial issues, all these kind of things. There's a lot of consensus over things that we could do, but we don't get anything done to solve them. Why? Because the two parties attract two different sets of groups, and they don't want to cooperate because you can't get anything done by doing that. The way you get things done in this polarized world is to tell people emotionally that the other people are wrong, and if you feel bad, it's because it's their fault. So that's and that's coming to churches, right? So churches have become more and more homogeneous in how they think. And if you don't think the way the other people in the church think, then either they show you the door or you find out pretty quick that I'm going to leave. And then the third thing is decline. We are seeing decline, and the decline is based both on birth rate and switching. So in 2007, when Pew Research did a major religious landscape study, 78% of the country said they were Christian. That's down to 64%. Pew is projecting by 2070, so in 50 years, that number will be between a third and 45%. So that's declining, right? And that's mostly because churches have too many old people and not enough babies. So if you have more funerals than you have baptisms, then you're going to decline. And churches think that they grew by attracting people and evangelizing and stuff. No, churches grew by people coming into church, having babies, passing on to their kids, and then you bring more people in, and they have babies and they pass on to their kids. Well, that has been disrupted in America. So people have fewer kids, and they keep fewer of the kids in church. So it's going to decline. And then more people leave than come in. So Pew Research basically says there's no mathematical model based on all the data we have in the current trends that shows a revival of Christianity growing. It's going to shrink. Now, there are things that you can do to change that, but these are the things that churches face. So again, you might think, oh my gosh, my church is, and there's one last thing I'll say, because I got 8 million things to say. But most people don't know this. Most church people don't know this, because the average church person goes to a church with 350 people. They all go to big churches. So they go to church and they go, here's all my people. We're all doing great. Everything's awesome. They go into culture and say, why don't people think Christians are great? They don't see them having the influence, but they don't experience themselves. And they're unaware that all the other little churches are in trouble and are declining. And those big churches, one last thing, because I'll talk forever, is those churches, we think that a big church is a sign of health. Awesome. Look at that big mega churches. Everything's going great. People go to mega churches and big churches, give less, they attend less, they volunteer less. So we have created really fragile, giant institutions and put all our people in there. And they're led by people who are human. And what happens when we put humans in charge? They make a train wreck out of things. So when a big church pastor fails, it's like 30 or 40 other churches fail. Little church fails, it has a problem, but it only affects a certain number of people. But a big church fails, it affects a lot of people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So that's a long answer.
Yeah, that's great. And this is, Bob, don't be apologetic. You're the focus of this, so we want to hear from you. Dan's going to come up and just do something with Bob's mic, I think.
Did I mess up my mic?
Well, as the mic is being switched, one thing that, Bob, when you sit back down, you can talk about is how churches are institutions. They're core institutions in our society. And we've talked, sort of the conversation is about a larger crisis of trust in institutions. And so how much is the church sort of uniquely in a crisis moment versus just the church being an institution and our society having a broader institutional crisis?
Hold on one sec. There we go.
I feel like a star here.
Yeah.
My mic. And do you give me a hand for our AV person? Thank you. And I'm sorry if I broke the mic. I don't know what I did. But no, this is the big problem. Right? It's an institutional problem. So again, it goes back to if you think that your church is to blame for things going wrong, that could be part of it. But the bigger question is people don't trust institutions anymore. They rely on them so much, right? Think of all the things we rely on churches for. So think in Florida right now where there's disaster relief going on. Who's showing up to clean up those trees, cook all those meals, help people clean out their houses? Religious groups. Religious groups are the largest set of volunteers in disaster. Who does refugee resettlement? Religious groups. Who's running hospitals and schools? Now, secular people do this as well, but religious groups play a large role in that. And so we rely on them, these institutions, but they are not respected anymore. And you can no longer say, because I am a religious leader, you are going to listen to me. This is a problem for the religious leaders. Some of them who have been taught by theology and practice that they're the one in charge, right? All these leaders, anybody to a leadership conference or a pastor, the leader, everything depends on you. Well, it's there's a sociologist named Josh Packard who talked about what he called the Hamlet problem. So religious leaders and institutions think that they're the star of the show. And everything that happens is because of them. And if it goes right, it's because they're so smart. If it goes wrong, it's because they did something wrong. Well, really, you're a bit player in a larger drama. And the drama is going on all around you, and you have to adapt to that. But if you think that if you've been trained to think, I'm in charge, and this is really a terrible thing for leaders. Because if you spent your whole life getting to be like a bishop or the head of a church or all these things, you waited your whole life, you got to be 50, I'm in charge, and no one cares what you think. This is awful, right? But it's the reality. The great part is, since you don't have to be right all the time, that's freeing. If you can say, I don't have to be right all the time. How do we do this together? It's a better, more healthy thing. You don't have to bear it all on yourself. But that's a big adjustment. It's a big adjustment. And it's a big blow to the ego to be, the Pope and nobody cares what you say, right? Yeah. Or to be the bishop or the pastor, because so much of your identity, and you feel called by God to be special. And you have devoted your life to this, and then it's like, okay, no, you can't have that anymore. You might have something better, but you're not going to have that trust. And you have to rebuild. But what you have to do is rebuild trust. You can no longer assume that who you are will give you entree to people. And you have to work harder to get access and trust.
So whether we're each in church leadership or not, I think we are familiar with these trends you talked about, change, polarization. and decline. And so I want to center on the idea that there is a decline, at least in church attendance and affiliation. There's many ways you could judge how religious people are, but those are certainly valid ones. What are just the top reasons why church attendance is in decline?
So it's a couple of reasons. Am I doing something wrong with my mic again? Well, so anyway, one data point I didn't give you before. It's the average church. I think maybe I told you this. The average church when I started covering religion was 137 people. You got 137 people. You can do all kinds of things. You can pay a pastor. You can have all kinds of programs. You can have a sustainable future. The average church now has 65 people. That's not a lot of people. And that's the median church size. So half the churches in the country have less than 65 people. So you are also at a point where all those churches are, if they lose 20, 30 more people, then there are 30 people. That's not a sustainable future. You're not going to be able to pay the bills long term, especially if you got a big old church. So people leave for a couple reasons. One, they leave because of this polarization, because they don't think they belong anymore. Two, they leave because of transactional religion, and that goes two ways. So part of the transaction is, so the way religion works is there's belief, behavior, and belonging, 3 Bs. And some of the churches that belong, am I breaking this mic again? I don't know what I did, but sorry. Oh. Am I better? Okay, sorry.
Let's see. Yeah.
All right, let's see if this thing works. The universe is conspiring against me. I'm trying to remember where it was now. 3 Bs, 3 Bs, right?
Yep.
What we have lost is, so behavior means ritual, right? Ritual. And so in churches had rituals and sacraments, all kinds of things. So a lot of the behavior and belonging part has been hollowed out. We only focus on belief. And it's transactional. If you believe these things, we love you forever. You don't believe this, we don't love you. So it's easy to be, so that on one side, the church says, you have to believe everything we say or else you're out. And that's this polarization. We know you're not one of us, get out. The second part is the people come, they only come if you give them what they want. I was talking to, I don't know if you remember, a couple weeks ago, there were a bunch of folks who were recent arrivals in the country, some of them asylum seekers, that were sent on a plane to Martha's Vineyard, right? So they show up at Martha's Vineyard, and they don't know why they're there. No one's gonna. So what do? They call the church people. Church people say, "Okay, we know what to do. We're fine. We'll take care of this." So I have to call and talk about this from a religion reporter. Well, I'm talking to one of the ministers there, the Unitarian Church on Martha's Vineyard. And you think Unitarians, they love everybody, right? They're all going to get along. She's doing a whole thing in her church on belonging. Why? Because people in her church don't trust each other. They don't belong. They only come if you give them what they want. I was thinking this is only a conservative problem. No, and it's a bottom-up problem. So, and then the third thing is people know when you don't want them, right? They know if you don't want them. I was listening to a sermon the other day by a megachurch pastor, kind of pre-election, going on about the left this, the left that, the left, they're out to get you. Then it's like, remember our evangelism campaign. I'm thinking, so anyone who didn't come to your church, who votes in what you call left-leaning, knows that they're not welcome there. And people know that you don't love them. And if you don't love them, you could tell them Jesus loves them all day long. That's great. They're not going to come to church. So that's a lot of it. And then we have the problem that people just never showed up in the first place because of the birth rate and the switching stuff.
Right. So there's these structural things, and then sort of more short term.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we do have this situation where there's broad decline in attendance, what are the main ways you've seen churches responding to this? And I want to there's sort of negative ways and also positive ways.
Yeah.
I think that churches.
So there's two things. One thing, sometimes people circle the wagons, right? There's been kind of a growth of circling the wagons, and we're just going to do it our way. In fact, there's kind of a growth of something fascinating called seeker-sensitive Christian nationalism, which is fascinating, which is where you use God and country to bring people into your church. and say we're all going to be together and here's the enemies. I'm like, that's fascinating. I don't know if it's very healthy, but it's fascinating, right? So you circle the wagons, you ignore it, you just soldier on. Or some people just say we're going to adapt and figure out what to do. Sometimes they say we're going to change our theology to do this. They do all kinds of things. But I've seen some churches say, okay, we have to give up the stuff. So I'll give you two short examples. One of my favorite churches is this church called Inner Bay Covenant Church, which is long deceased. Everybody know who Mars Hill Church was? Mars Hill Church, biggest church, one of the biggest churches in the country, giant church. It's in Seattle. Back in about a decade ago, it's dying. It doesn't know it's dying. It's imploded from the inside. About a mile away, there's this little evangelical covenant church called Inner Bay Covenant Church. It's dying too. It's like 65, 70 people, kind of healthy, but it's old and they think we don't have a future. But they're renting space to a multi-ethnic church that's meeting on their thing. And the pastor of that church and the pastor of Inner Bay become friends. And the pastor of this Inner Bay Covenant Church is a second career pastor. He'd been an engineer at Boeing, been associate pastor. In his late 50s, he gets his first church, right? So he's like, now I've got my first church. And he realized we're doing okay, but we are not going to do well for the long term. So it's like, okay, what we're going to do, what we really should do is merge with that younger church and die as our church so that the bigger church can grow. So they do this over coffee and he brings it up and then they bring it up to the church and the church votes. They say, we won't do it unless it's unanimous. They don't get a unanimous vote. They say, wait a little longer. They decide to, eventually they merge. That church does well. The church happens to have now a woman pastor. So if you know anything about Mars Hill, women, could never speak in those churches. Mars Hill implodes, the pastor goes downhill. Who buys their church? This Little Quest church. Buys their church. First woman to speak there is the woman of the church, which still is existence, even though that other church is long gone. And you would have thought, because one church knew it was dying and needed change. My other favorite story in the whole universe, wow, I've got a million of them, is a church called All Saints. All Saints is a little church in Smyrna, Tennessee. And I'll say one aside, I only found out about this. I was meeting with a bishop, or I was meeting with a pastor, and he was talking about all the things he was doing. And then he says, I got to go meet with the bishop. You having coffee afterwards? And he says, oh, but because we're going to talk about this church that was saved by refugees. Like, that's the lead. This is the problem for church leaders, and my complaint. You live in a world of miracles and wonders, and you don't tell anybody. You'll tell us about the bake sale. You'll tell us about the memorial fund. You'll tell us about some anniversary. You won't tell us about the miracles that happen around you. So tell people those stories. But this story is All Saints. So All Saints is a little church. They're an Episcopal church, and they're a church plant. They're doing really well. Smyrna, Tennessee, about an hour outside of Nashville. Then Episcopalians are fighting over sexuality and all kinds of stuff. So the pastor of that church gets mad at the presiding bishop and takes his flocks and leaves. Leaves a dozen people. Now, this is a dozen people who just spent 10 years building up a congregation, finally get a church, they borrow $1 million to build it, they think they're going to have a future, and everyone they love left. Their pastor left. And because they were good Episcopalians, they're like, no, this is our church. We want to stay here. I thought we came here to build this thing. So they're feeling betrayed and lonely and angry, and they bring in a new pastor in to shut down their building, sell off this thing that they love. So they bring in a new pastor. He starts to sell off the building. Who shows up but a bunch of folks from Myanmar, refugees. So if you know anything about Myanmar, there are a lot of refugees. There are a lot of Christians there. It's mostly a Buddhist country, some Muslim, but there are Anglicans and Baptists. Who knew? Because a lot of missionaries went there. So these Anglican refugees show up and go, we need a place to worship. And the pastor's a little worried because he's like, we're going to let you down. We're going to close. But they start showing up and they come to the church and then they start raising some money. They start a farmer's market. They save the church and the church is still going strong. And it's almost breaking even now. But this church, these people thought, oh my God, the world has ended. And they could have said no. They could have said no. And the people who left, not to blame them, but people left over an important church divide missed this thing they could have had. And this people who were like, oh no, the end of the world has come. Then the end of the world came and then something better happened. And something they didn't know was going to happen. But that can happen if people choose that. It's not always going to happen. Some people close. But there's a kind of, if you know that One thing churches do sometimes is say, oh, things have changed. How are we going to adapt to this? How do we be faithful in this moment?
So that'll bring us to our last question here. We do want to get to some table discussion time, and then we'll have a couple local respondents to Bob's book. But Bob, if we could get the 60-second version maybe of your editorializing about where you think the church needs to respond in this moment. Probably got some of that through these stories, but if you could sort of just generalize it.
So a couple things. One, okay, should I do this one instead? I'm going to do this instead. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, awesome. Apologies for that. I probably did something to break this. Sometimes I'm technologically challenged, so I know how to break things. So a couple things. One, I would say, realize that what you do is really important, that the world around you relies on churches in incredible ways. And not just the people now, but people 40 and 50 years from now will still rely on it. Think of all the people that made your life possible. And a lot of you have been influenced by church and churches and institutions. Those were built by people who probably didn't know what they were doing, but were faithful and built those things knowing that not just for themselves, but so that the world around them could thrive and people in the future thrive. So one, know that you really matter. Second, do not buy into the nonsense. We have a world where all the incentives are to hate other people and to get short-term gain by owning whoever you don't like, owning the libs, owning the conservatives, all this kind of stuff. The world is doing that. It doesn't need more people to do that. And what churches and faith-based institutions and religious people have are all the things the world needs. You know how to resolve differences. You know how to build identity across in new places. You know how to do self-examination. Oh, I did some things wrong. You know how to make amends for when you do things wrong. You know how to, Carrie Parker, who's the executive director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches, she's in the book. One thing she said is churches have this wealth of history and resources. It's not like this is the first time the world has changed and people have adapted. So draw on all those things. And you know how to mend broken things. So give that to the world. Don't give them the nonsense. And don't do dumb things. That's the other thing. I report all the time on dumb things religious people. If you're thinking, I'm going to do a dumb thing, don't. Just don't. Because if you think no one is going to find out, they will. And then we'll all be worse off. So, and we really have a choice right now in our culture. All of us have this choice. Do we want to, especially religious people, religious religion harms people and it can heal them. And we have choices right now to say, do we want to create more harm or do we want to help people heal? And I don't know what people will choose because they're afraid and they're freaked out. The world is being deconstructed around them. All the myths and narratives about who we were, and we are finding out that we are not as awesome as we thought. And that is the worst thing to find out, to get to be like, I'm 58. I'm 57, no, I'm 57. And my kids have now told me that I am not as awesome as I thought I was. I'm pretty awesome, but not as awesome as I thought it was. That's hard, right? It's hard to think, oh, I have more to learn now, and I have more to say I'm sorry for, and more people to listen to, and I'm still going to make mistakes. But that's what religion does, right? It teaches us how to mend the things we've done wrong and do better. So do that, because the future of American religion is in your hands, and people are counting on you. So don't let them down.
Thank you, Bob. Let's give Bob a hand. So thank you, Bob, for that stirring ending there. Also, don't do dumb things. I think that'll be all of our takeaways today. So we're going to transition here into a short time of table discussion before we have a couple respondents come up. And so there's going to be a slide on the screen here that has the question to talk about in your group, and that's how have you and your church experienced or responded to the trends that we've been talking about here, and how else do you see these trends playing out in the Dane County area to the extent that you sort of have a grasp on sort of the larger story. So take about 5 to 7 minutes here to talk about that, and we'll call you back at the end of that time.
Well, there's clearly so much to discuss this morning. We're going to progress to the next section of our program and keep this conversation moving. I'd like to actually invite Bob back to the stage, as well as Christopher James and Carrie Parker. We're going to have a large chunk of time to ask questions of all three of these panelists, but we're going to hear from two of them as respondents to the conversation this morning and Bob's research and work on these trends we've heard about. And I'd like to say a few words about both Christopher James and Carrie Parker here. Reverend Dr. Christopher James is Associate Professor of Evangelism and Missional Christianity at University of Dubuque Theological Seminary, and also the author of Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil. He holds degrees from Boston University, Fuller Seminary, and Wheaton College. Chris is involved in several Madison-based projects, many of which you probably know about, including roles as Learning Community Curator for Awaken Dane, Director of the Dane Churches Project, Director of Missio Madison, and Director of the recently launched Madison Learning Community through University of Dubuque Theological Seminary that offers seminary-level courses here in Madison. He is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. He and his wife, Lindsay, share the joy of raising two zesty kids. Zesty. Okay, we'll see if that emerges. No. Now, Reverend Carrie Parker is the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches, bringing a strong faith commitment to ecumenical ministry and demonstrated leadership in leading complex coalitions toward a common goal. She also serves on the Leadership Steering Committee for Awaken Dane. Prior to coming to the council, she served as pastor of McFarland UCC in McFarland, Wisconsin. And Reverend Parker has served on the board of directors of the Wisconsin Conference of the United Church of Christ and United Church Camps Incorporated. She's published in the anthology There's a Woman in the Pulpit as well. She's a graduate of Smith College and the Chicago Theological Seminary. Reverend Parker is a member of Orchard Ridge UCC in Madison, Wisconsin, and lives in McFarland with her family. So, Chris, I'd like to invite you first to offer your remarks, and then Carrie will follow.
Thank you. Bob, really appreciated your book. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, we had some of the folks who advised the seminary listen to a podcast with you to help bring some of the trends into our own reflection as to help us understand our role in the religious ecology. My task, as I understand it, is to try to situate some of what we've heard about from Bob and also things that are in the book, more in the local scene here. As Melissa mentioned, I did some research and have been pretty engaged in the Madison context, although I do live in Dubuque, Iowa. So I've got four things I want to lift up real briefly. I have just a little time. The first is just simply to say the disaffiliation and the decline stuff is really relevant here. Secularization, nuns, and all that. Just a couple statistics. In 2019, the last time that Barna ranked the most post-Christian cities in the U.S., Madison was 11th, just after Seattle. In 2020, PRRI, they ran a U.S. religion census, and they found that the percent of folks in Dane County who are religiously unaffiliated, we sometimes call these nuns, was 40%, which, to set it in context, they also found in that same study that the average U.S. context had 23% unaffiliated. So 40 is obviously a lot more. So again, disaffiliation and dechurching are very relevant and pronounced in a place like Madison. Second, on the topic of the polarization and the political effects, just a couple of data points here. Again, this is a 2019 study that was looking at what are the factors that lead to affective polarization. It was things like urban, old, white, and well-educated places and people tend to be the most, not just polarized politically, like on one end of the other side in far as policies, but to have that sort of negative animus toward people on the other end. So this sort of emotional polarization, not just policy polarization. They found in this study, then based on those things, they suggested that Dane County was in the 100th percentile for being the most prejudiced against the political other. So 100th percentile, meaning line up 100 counties, Dane County is going to be the most affectively polarized. One other thing, I conducted a study in 2019, just so I think you may be interested in this. And one of the questions on the survey that I asked the church leaders here in Dane County was, are folks in your church significantly more Democrat, somewhat more Democrat, mostly 50-50, a little bit more Republican or significantly more Republican. And about 30% of the churches in Dane County that responded to this survey, so that's out of 118 churches, said they had significantly more Democrats. Only 8% had significantly more Republicans. So in 2019, and this is before the really power boost that sort of energized this polarization, with COVID and with the unrest that followed the death of George Floyd, these things really did drive some of that polarization in churches. But even in 2019, 40% of churches had a very clear, strong lean toward one side or the other of the political spectrum. About 32% of the churches that responded said they had roughly equal numbers. Purple churches, they'd sometimes be called. I can't say how that compares to other places, but I think it's fair to say that both on the sort of religious dynamics of nuns and on the political dynamics, Madison is sort of an extreme example of some of what you've described. You mentioned in the book, you didn't talk too much about it, but in Seattle, you talked about Quest and Interbay Covenant merging. And so I thought I'd lift up a couple examples locally of things that have sort of taken a similar type of shape. Of course, in addition to the kind of consolidation mergers that happen when two small churches of a single denomination, become one to just keep things going, I can think of a handful here. So Trinity Lutheran Church, an ELCA church on the Isthmus, recently welcomed Madison Church to share space and a kind of partnership. Madison Church is a non-denominational church, and they're sharing space. Bethany Evangelical Free Church shares its space with three other churches, Greater Madison Chinese Evangelical Free Church, Nueva Vida Church, and Bethany Lao. And so there's worship happening in 4 languages in that space. A couple of more even creative examples. One is called Common Grace. This is a partnership and shared space between an ELCA and Moravian church. One of them sold their building. They moved into the other. They're trying to do a significant renovation of their space, so it's like a community center. And they retain the identities of these two churches. And then finally, another example sort of along the lines of these mergers, Christ the Solid Rock Baptist and Lake Edge United Church of Christ, which their sort of alliance, they call the Alliance at 4200, reference to their address. They're worshiping in the same building. They maintain their identities, but of course, central to this alliance is this intentional modeling of black and white congregations partnering together and trying to be a witness in that way. I should also mention Madison Christian Community has been in a partnership of 2 congregations, ELCA and UCC, going back 50 years. They built their own building, and it's really kind of a early example of this. Last thing I wanted to lift up just for consideration, I think there's maybe one other response to the reorganization that we're seeing that is present here in Madison and in quite a number of other places. And that's the formation of what would be called city networks, or sometimes city gospel movements. They represent an organizational form of what one of the people you called kingdom-mindedness, this sense that my particular congregation is less important than the whole church of this place. And these organizations tend to engage in unity and mission practices. John 17, Jesus's prayer for that the church would be one and that the world would know who Jesus is because of that unity, is sort of an animating vision. And these kinds of networks have popped up in like 50 or more U.S. cities over the last 15 years. Here in Madison, the organization that's doing precisely this is Collaboration Project, which launched 3 years ago. There's its executive director, John Anderson. And, in addition to, yes, I love what they're doing, really do. And he can talk your ear off about what they do. Really beautiful stuff, bringing people or various churches together to serve the community through an annual big serve day for Dane, serving pastors in rest and renewal retreats, organizing, sort of sharing knowledge around how to do school partnerships, how to engage with human trafficking, that kind of thing. And anyway, since we're having a conversation about reorganizing religion, I think this is one of the responses that we see to sort of the new landscape, is this sort of, as the denominational identities and resources go down, other organizational forms like the city network have sprung up to give the church ways of connecting, supporting, and engaging in its mission together. So I just wanted to lift that up. I think that's all I have to say. Carrie, would you take it away?
Thanks, Chris. It's so good to hear your perspective as a professor and a researcher on all of these great projects here in my hometown and all of these great colleagues, right? It's like to think about these as church building efforts and kingdom building efforts and recognizing the reign of God breaking forth here in our midst. And to think about them also as evidence of what Bob is talking about in his book. So thank you, Bob, for being here with us today and for the chance, Upper House, to respond to what we've heard about so far today. I'm bringing a statewide perspective from the Wisconsin Council of Churches. We're an ecumenical organization connecting 21 different Christian traditions. And when I look at how churches have responded over the time period from pre-COVID through this not quite post-COVID time, what we've seen is that churches with mission, purpose, and identity, which is different from mission, purpose, and identity statements, are the ones that have thrived. Those who decided to wait COVID out haven't thrived. Those who have said, well, you know, it's fine. We'll just, you know, church is closed for now, as opposed to church is in the world. We're out in the world with God's people versus, no, we're just closing the building. Those churches were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The churches that have been active with feeding ministries and housing ministries and all sorts of ministries to the community have continued to thrive and grow over this time period. Second thing I want to say is that angst over the survival of the church is largely a racialized phenomenon of privilege. You have privilege worrying about the survival of the institution is an option. You don't. Church is a community of survival. My BIPOC colleagues have known for much longer than I have that when one expression of the faith community has to dissolve, another one's going to rise up and take its place. My BIPOC colleagues are worrying about the survival of the people within the institution more than they're worrying about the survival of the institution. Third thing I want to say, institutions are tools. We don't worship tools, we worship God. We follow Jesus, and we have spent too long making the institution the idol. So when we get caught up in all of this angst that Bob has documented, it's because we're misplacing our attention. We can't restructure our way out of crisis. We need to shift our attention, and I think Bob does some documenting of this, from the institution to the ecosystem. He quotes my colleague in Massachusetts, Laura Everett, who's really worried about what might happen if churches aren't around to tend to the needs of the communities, right? How active we are in communities and what we do for the civic good, how we back up government and private organizations. The thing is, that's not about an institution or a corporate structure of church. That's about our relationships with our communities. So we need to look at our ecosystems. How are we enmeshed with our communities? How are we relating with one another? It's not about how we're structured. If we think we can restructure ourselves out of crisis, we're just moving the deck chairs around. The last thing I want to say, and Bob alluded to this earlier, we have everything we need. Everything we need. We too often get caught up in what we lack. But precarity has long been a condition of discipleship. We have what we've had from the beginning, and it's never left us. We have the stories, we have meals, we have community, Jesus and the Spirit. There's no reason any of that has to go away unless we're not paying attention. So thank you.
This conversation with all of you, you represent what's happening here locally in Madison and Dane County. I'm sure there's questions around the room, and these wonderful people are going to engage, and we'll see where it goes this morning. But we only have one mic for Q&A, so I'm going to run as fast as I can. If you just want to raise your hand, I will come find you. My colleague Dan Hummel over here, he will help me try to find you so that we reach people on both sides of the room and I move around efficiently. So thank you again, and we'll just open things up. Phil.
Yeah, so you, Chris, you talked about the Alliance at 4200, the sort of black and white congregation. Bob, in your book, you wrote about one of the futures for the church is having more multiracial, multi-ethnic congregations. Carrie, you talked about the difference in how black folks, white folks. So Dane County, pretty white, but what do churches need to be thinking about in terms of bridging and collaborating around racial and ethnic issues?
I'm going to sound like a broken record. Relationship. If you're a white church, a predominantly white church, don't visit or approach a multi-ethnic church or a predominantly Black church or other church of color expecting them to save you. That is not their job. They exist in and of themselves as a community of faith and as children of God. Perhaps you might begin a relationship and see what emerges from there. You are also not there to fix. Start there, build a relationship, and see what happens.
There's a couple of really interesting things data-wise and they're based on this. So one of the things is that 1 in 4 congregations now qualifies as multi-ethnic, which means it's more than 20% are different than the majority population of the church. So there's kind of a caveat to that. When churches become more diverse, it's usually people of color coming to a mostly white church. You almost see no journey the other way. People who are white join churches of color. So that's one thing that's not happening. The other thing is this is where the kind of political polarization in the country and the reality of the church, both theologically and kind of philosophically and existentially clash, right? So you can build, well, here's one thing. You can no longer build sustainable congregations on white people. You used to be able to do that in America. Almost everybody was white. You used to be able to, you can't do that anymore. So you can't become more diverse, though, by saying, well, now we need people of color to come to our church to save it our way, right? It's got to become, why doesn't our church reflect the world around us? But what's happened in some churches become more diverse is you went from people sitting side by side in the same building but not together, to people having relationships. And now you're going to have more peer groups, right? So you're going to have people, Christians of color, among young people especially, Christians, the number of Christians of color and the white Christians are about the same. They're going to be peers. And when you're somebody's peer, you tell them things you don't tell them when you're outnumbered 7 or 8 to 1, because you're sharing. And so the future, now it's really hard, right? Because one of the things that's hard is that the older people have a hard time giving up to younger people. Older white congregations are going to have a hard time giving up power to a diverse young group of people. And people are going to tell us things that we didn't want to hear. I'm white, so I'm going to say people are going to tell each other honest things. So now you have what people thought they were friends and they had relationships in these churches. As they get closer, all of a sudden people are going to say, and you've seen this in some big churches, right? The most famous one is a church, it's led by David Platt. It's McLean Bible Church, kind of big, giant church out and David is best known for his book called Radical, kind of a superstar among young evangelicals. Church becomes more diverse. They start talking about race. All of a sudden, the old people go, you're woke. It's going to implode because all of a sudden people were telling themselves truth. So I think, like, again, back to what Carrie said and what I was trying to say earlier, we know what to do when people tell us the truth that we're not so awesome. Well, crap. Sorry. That's a right? Right? Okay, I'm not so awesome. This is what God tells you. You're terrible people and you got to get better. Okay, and you can get better. But like being able to say, okay, I've been terrible. I've got to listen. I've got to get better. We have to have real relationship and sort of not like, so can I tell you a story about myself? One second. So when I was in my 20s, I worked for Habitat for Humanity. And I was a young white guy in charge of and everyone on my board was black. It's in a black neighborhood. Why they put me in charge at 23, why I thought I should be in charge, why I thought I was smarter than everybody was, I don't know. I was terrible at it, right? I train wrecked. But at one point I was like, why is everyone who's African-American I talk to is always laughing when we talk? I'm like, we don't have a real relationship. There's some performative things going on here that I'm not smart enough. And I'm not smart enough to even know this, right? But like, so I find myself at 57 going, well, I've got to learn a whole bunch. And I report on all kinds of diverse churches and trying to, and some of the things problem for reporters is some of the churches of color aren't as sophisticated with the media, so they don't get in the media as much. You don't talk to folks, you don't have relationships. But there's like, there's a point to say, okay, people are going to tell us things about ourselves. And we hear this in the media, like, you are doing a terrible job. And you want to say, no, I'm not. I'm doing the righteous thing. And you're like, oh, crud, I'm not. And so it's okay to be terrible. This is what I'm not a theologian, but that's, I think, what the Bible says. You're all awful, terrible train wrecks, but you could get better. So if you can just give up the idea, this is actually, I became a reporter after train wrecking in the nonprofit world and being really awful, which train wrecking in your 20s is the best thing because you lose the illusion that you are awesome. And I feel bad for people who have gotten later in life and realize, oh, crud. Like I lost all illusions that I was really smart a long time ago. But I would just say that for you. Give yourself permission to say, okay, we're awful. And listen, because there's no future apart, right? You can kind of wall each other off, and there's no future where we can go back to where we were, because where we were wasn't so great. So that's okay. And we can be aspirational, right? This is what America's going through this whole thing. We can be aspirational about who we could be and who churches could be, and honest about what we are not at the same time. Both things can be true. That was a little sermon, sorry.
So as many of you know, I'm working with a small church in Apple River, Illinois, and trying to keep them from dying. Although another person said to me they're already dead. But we've financially stabilized them, so that's very exciting. My question for the three of you is, could you tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing and learning about rural churches in America?
Churches are awesome. They really are. I know a rural church. There's a church in Kentucky, McCreary County, Kentucky. It's in Stearns, Kentucky, one of the 5 poorest counties in the country. Has long been. It's a coal country. Every Thanksgiving. So next week, this is a church of like 50 people. They're going to put on a Thanksgiving meal for 1,500 people in the town. Everyone in town is going to come to it for free. They run a free restaurant. They run all this kind of stuff. They are the center of life there. They cooperate. But I know mega churches that could not do that, right? I know well-off churches that could not do this stuff. Now, rural churches have all kinds of problems, right? But some in the South, they're kind of still the center of life. They're still the place, the one institution that's still there. And what I noticed, so we used to be in the Bible Belt. Spent 15 years there. One of the things I learned about small town Bible Belt is a lot of the barriers between denominations and stuff have broken down because they all need each other, right? They don't have the religious leaders there don't have the capacity to not need other people, right? They're independent. So they're also in problems, and people don't live there. You have churches in places where people don't live, and so they're not going to have a long-term future. But there are some lessons there of like we're interdependent, and we're the one thing still standing, so they're really important.
I'll just briefly comment on this. As a seminary, we serve students all over the country and do have quite a few folks who are serving in rural communities. And as you probably know, a lot of these churches can't afford a pastor and to upkeep their building. And in a certain way, I mean, the gift there, as Bob pointed out earlier, is when people are more engaged, more committed, more actively volunteering, but of course, they're often also aging and shrinking or dying, So there you have a sense of active, engaged community, but also sort of the overhead expenses of the traditional ways of running the institution of the church, paying a full-time clergy, maintaining a building. One of my colleagues has been doing work out in rural churches in Montana, and the work that's been central to her, and she's working with churches that are in this situation, don't have a pastor, can't afford a pastor, can't find a future. And I think at the heart of the work, maybe in a church like yours, is to change the question from how do we keep our church going to how does God want to see us participating, making sure there is an ongoing witness to the gospel in this community. And that might mean partnering with other churches, that might mean selling the building or doing any number of things. But instead of how do we maintain the sort of offering plate funded building and professional, how do we maintain a vibrant Christian witness in this community? What's our call for participating in that? I think that's a real big and important shift of questions.
What Chris said, that's perhaps the most exciting conversation that's happening among regional ministers in Wisconsin about smaller rural churches that are looking for ways to thrive. If you've got a small community with 4 churches on Church Street that are all trying to say, how can I survive? That question isn't working. But if you have a rural community where religious leaders are saying together, how do we maintain a vibrant gospel witness here? That's a transformational question.
Back on that. So this goes back to the question of how do churches of different ethnicities work together. So you have this kind of, so what we see sometimes, we saw in the South a lot of times is old church will be dying, a new church plan will come and they'll give the building, right? They'll say, okay, you can have our building. But you almost never see, you don't see that across denominational lines, but you almost never see across ethnic lines. You don't see a church saying like, hey, I got this building. So in the book, there's a story with an Episcopal church in Knoxville, right? They're dying. Episcopal church says they sell it to a African immigrant Pentecost church that's going gangbusters. They never in their mind thought, oh, this is not our church. We got this resource. We got no people. Who could we invest this thing in? And we're going to have thousands and thousands of churches. We have thousands and thousands of churches that have too much building and not enough people. And they may have, because the churches of color are doing better, that people of color are still leaving churches, right? But there are other churches that are growing up, Pentecostal, immigrant churches, that are starving for resources. That instead of saying, how do I sell this building, put it in a fund, an endowment to keep my endowment going, is there a way to have a bigger vision and say, oh, what could this do for someone else? That a gospel, because you can say the gospel vision across the denomination line, but a gospel vision that says, oh, who are all the other people that God could be working through that this could belong to them? And we have denominational structures that are thinking, how do I keep myself alive? That's money in the bank. I want to keep that forever because I can keep it going. Instead of saying, oh, I could give this. I mean, I rarely see that across ethnic lines.
Can I just add? I'll just add one little thing that I was thinking this with in respect to Phil's question earlier. In not just giving it away, but seeing this as a moment of our own discipleship. I love what Carrie said. The precarity is sort of goes hand in hand with the life of discipleship. And this is something often that non-majority or immigrant churches can teach white churches. We haven't, many white churches, many white people have not experienced real precarity in ways that, our siblings in Christ across ethnic or national lines have. And so it's not just we can help them. It's they can actually teach us something about following Jesus that we couldn't learn on our own. So, I mean, that's the invitation. The kind of relationship I would look for is not just who can we help and how can we help them, but the kind of relationship in which how can they teach me about what it means to really follow Jesus.
So I have a question. Yeah. This has been really interesting. What is coming to my mind is I want to know your thoughts on how does this impact the kids and the children's ministry in our congregations. I work with youth, like middle school ministry a lot of times, and oftentimes I work with Blackhawk, which is a much larger church. We'll have families that send their kids to our middle school ministry, or like I've heard people talking about, oh, we'll go to this church for right now for our kids. What kind of mindset should we have? Or like what is the hope and the future for the kids we are raising up in this next generation of the reorganized religion?
My perspective on this is to remember that while people want to belong, nobody wants to be owned. So recognize that people want spaces of belonging, places where they feel like they're part of something, but that they may find their spiritual needs met in multiple places, and that can be okay. It is not a failure on the part of any one community of Christ if they don't get their needs met all in one place. So that's one piece of what I would have to say from the get-go.
I mean, just very briefly, I mean, the social element is so important, obviously, for all youth. It's actually almost as important for adults. We just don't admit it. And also, research is pretty clear on the importance of young people having relationships with people who are non-parental figures, who are their community of belonging. I'm not sure that sort of the traditional ways of doing youth ministry really facilitate that really very well in actually enfolding young people into the life of a community, even though they may have a couple sort of aunts and uncles in the faith that are volunteering with the youth. So these are real big challenges. And of course, doing all our ministries in age cohorts and then they go off to college, there's real challenges. I do think sort of the heart of it is this sense of belonging. And I'll say one other thing that I think is really critical, just because I didn't know where I was going to fit this comment in here, but I think it can fit here. Kids may think that church is cool. They may like to belong. But if they don't actually experience God as a living, acting person, an agent in the world, they can find that stuff somewhere else. And they aren't going to really care. And this is an issue for our churches too. I mean, we can't market our churches just based on sort of the material benefits of it. It's good for your longevity and, you'll be a better person. Like, who cares? And we need in many of our churches to sort of recenter God. That sounds so obvious, but to actually not just talk about how we're trying to be good people and we're trying to be thoughtful and good citizens, but talk about God and be willing to tell each other about the little miracles. And so I think for our kids, that living sense of, in some traditions we'd say relationship with God, but I think something even bigger than that. The Hamlet problem sometimes is that we think everything revolves around us. Sometimes the opposite can be the problem. We think we're just a victim of the environment. But actually, Hamlet is God in the biblical narrative, meaning the main actor, the main character in the story is God. And the fate of our lives, the fate of our individual congregations, of our community, actually rests a lot on the action of God. And so if we can reorient ourselves around, okay, God, what are you doing? Are you dismantling? Are you building up? Are you opening up doors? Are you creating relationships? That's the kind of place where energy comes into a church, into an individual person's spiritual life, into the life of a pastor who's, tired of doing the work of ministry. You need a living connection to the sense that God's at work in the world.
One little thing. Oh, sorry, that's awesome. And I want to piggyback on that. So spectacle and experience are overrated. We have had all the churches, we got to have spectacle, experience. We have these wonderful times. But maybe people need to experience God and have people that love them and learn things. And because it used to be like we have the most awesome youth thing, the most awesome church group, the biggest band, the whatever. And maybe they just need to experience God and to have relationships with people and be together. And the consistency is super important, right? Because maybe people don't have that in their lives. And so having, I'll talk about myself again. I have friends, I was just in my hometown church talking about my book, and my Sunday school teacher from when I was 17 years old and goofy as heck was there. And she brought us donuts, right? She taught us about the Bible and really cared about this. That's really important. And one thing COVID is teaching us is that spectacle and experience are overrated. All these big churches are going, well, we get the best music and the best speaker and zippity-doo-dah. And then people can get that at home sitting on the couch. Why would they come here? Why would they come here? Because they get 80% of what they had without having to leave. So now they've got to say, oh, we have to get back to that stuff. So the kids ministry knows that. But sometimes the kids ministry leaders want to have this awesome experience or whatever. And I think the consistency and the teaching and helping people experience God is much better than spectacle.
I think one more thing that I would link what both of you said is the consistency and the relationality. That's something the small church does really well. Church is one of the few multi-generational spaces left to build those safe adult relationships in a space of faith is amazing. To be able to confirm for kids, youth, and even young adults, all of us who need to hear it, that this is God who loves us even when we mess up, especially when we mess up, and who will be there arms open wide, flinging God's self in our general direction the minute we take a step back home.
I think I got the mic. So, just first a little comment. So I grew up in Germany, trained in Germany, and growing up in Germany, I always thought. So, and I'm an ordained Lutheran pastor. So, by the way, so can follow some of the ideas a little bit. So, growing up, I always thought we always looked at America as the forerunner of ideas, and all the things that happened in America would happen 10, 20 years later in Germany and Europe. Now I can finally say the crisis of religion talk has reversed that trend, and now it's coming to America. So that's one. Two, yesterday I read Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison again. for an assignment in my class, but I read through it again. The conversation reminds me of that. It's this moment of crisis. We're in prison. The world has changed drastically. So looking for Christianity in a religious-less world, or in a world without religion, what can we do? How can we redefine religion, church, Christianity, what we're doing for the world? But having said that, what I haven't missed thus far is the big narrative here. So what are we doing? No, I think there's a lot of good I heard. I mean, we shrink down, we rediscover relationships across ethnic lines, racial lines, but what are we doing at the moment when Christian nationalism is on the rise and is dominating politics and the story of America? What are we doing when the young leaders at the Black Lives Matter movement are no longer religious, or at least no longer follow the big names in the Black community, in the African American community? What are we doing when the country is about to break apart? And we used to have a narrative, the Judeo-Christian tradition, for instance, a narrative, however how problematic that is, that's a different thing. But we used to have these big narratives that used to guide us, that used to pull the majority of people together, and provide kind of a canopy under which a story we could relate to. We could say, okay, we are part of that, no matter what background, what tradition. What's the big narrative here? What kind of, how can we be creative a little bit in terms of having a vision for what that means for the next generation of Americans, and how can we do about that? And one side comment, we haven't talked, so we touched on race, but we haven't talked about new technology, internet, digital age. And that, of course, is something that accelerated with the pandemic. So I'm working at the university. I know other people want to talk too. Okay. Well, Bob talked a lot, so I want to say something too. So since the pandemic, the university investigates seriously how religion can be a resource for students having mental health issues. So my point is, new technology accelerated by the pandemic is kind of changing the game again in a way we haven't been aware of. So that's more than a side note, I guess. So thanks.
I can take it. Yeah.
Go.
So, okay, no, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, okay, so a couple things. We are in this moment of like, we don't know what the story is anymore. We lost the narrative. That's true. We have to admit that, right? And part of admitting that we lost the narrative is, why did we lose the narrative? Because we weren't all the things that we thought we could be. So you could still have this aspirational, and there's a battle going on right now. Internet has actually, the internet has accelerated the misinformation, the mistrust. You can make a lot of money selling mistrust. You can make a lot of money, and I think churches sometimes and religious leaders think they have more authority than they do. They think they can speak to these things. And I think that actually, though the big narrative is important, the small narrative is important too, right? Churches are not ready for what they think they're ready for. I was making, and I'm making fun, there's a denomination I tease sometimes, that's one of the whitest denominations in the country, wants to dismantle white supremacy. And I think maybe you get some people who are different, are not white, come to your churches. Maybe figure out why that. Maybe you could start there. Has everybody heard of couch potato to 5K? Everybody ever run? It's a way how you become a runner, right? If you haven't run it, you do a little bit of time and you build on successes. That's what we need for churches, I think, is like some how do you build health? How do you build relationship? How do you be healthier? How do you gather people together, teach them, and grow this thing, and build enough trust so that people can talk about the big narratives? Because right now, there's not that trust and relationship needed. And there's not an honesty to say, yeah, we failed, but we could be this other thing. So I think people have to start much smaller and get healthier and be honest of where they are.
Just very briefly, I mean, you're diagnosing a real crisis, a societal crisis. I mean, because the major narratives that are actually out there are basically conflict narratives. They're basically us against them narratives. That's not a uniting or a viable way for a society or a nation to sort of have a good future together. We'd like to think that the church could provide an alternative narrative. We're caught short by the reality that we mostly are participating in the conflict narrative. I will say, I still have hope, largely because Jesus prayed for the unity of the church. And I think God hears that prayer and is in our own places ready, willing, and acting toward that. So, I mean, again, collaboration project, even Upper House and the work of Wisconsin councils. I think there are a number of initiatives here in Madison and many other places that are actually trying to help the church cultivate its alternative narrative, which then can be a resource and gift to the wider society. But as Bob said, I think we are in that crisis, and we don't have a ready solution there. I think we're going to be in a season where if we can't cultivate a narrative that is a narrative of hope, a narrative of unity, then we're just going to live in crisis for quite a while.
I think what you've just described to us, Ulrich, is that civic religion has been toxic for the civic sphere and for the church. And that trying to replicate a newer, better version of civic religion ain't gonna work. In our staff discussions at the Council of Churches, we've been talking about this problem of white Christian nationalism, and how are we going to respond? What are we going to do? Surely we have to speak into this. We can't just not respond to this moment. And then after much discussion, because church is going to talk. If there's nothing else a Council of Churches is going to do, it's have discussions. We realized that the gospel is not against. The gospel is for. God, in Jesus Christ, God is for us. And the message of the gospel in this moment, we decided, is about that alternative narrative, is about alternative narratives, is about plurality and multiplicity and inclusion rather than exclusion. And so we are going to invest ourselves in being that beautiful community and demonstrating what that can look like to the best of our ability, rather than trying to stand there and say, we are not.
All right, I've been told this is the last question, and I'll make it an easy one. So, building off what you've been talking about, a lot of our work is around trying to bring churches together, and one of the divides that I haven't yet heard mentioned that I'd love to hear your comments on are on different theological views of human sexuality and how you imagine the church moving forward and any possibility of coming together around those differences. Like I said, easy.
So I have no solution to this great dilemma because we have lots of different polities and theologies under our umbrella as a Council of Churches. I do know that starting with our baptismal identity as children of God and siblings in Christ is a fruitful beginning. I don't know where we go from there and if it's always a hopeful and holy conversation, but I do know that the best conversations start there for us.
I'm not a theologian, and so I'm a reporter, so I'm talking sociologically. There's a couple things. One is it's not, this issue of sexuality is not going to go away. You can't say we're going to get rid of certain churches and people who say this, and it's just going to go away will be fine, because young people, this is a real issue for. The second thing I would say is it's a really important thing for churches to talk about sexuality and difference. It is, so take the United Methodist Church. It's tearing the church apart. The church is imploding. What's the biggest problem the United Methodist Church faces? Sexuality? No. Nope. It's all tiny little churches. They're all going to die. The house is on fire around them. And if you fight all the time while the house is on fire, it will burn down and nothing will be left. So that's one thing I say to people. It's like, okay, you can talk about these things and figure them out, but that's not your existential crisis. And it's become the existential crisis for some churches. Say we have to talk about sexuality. It's the existential crisis of the time. And it's important. And so I'm again, a reporter, not a theologian. So I'm not going to tell you how that's all your job. But I want to say that meanwhile, the house is burning down and people need you, and what they don't need you is fighting. And the second thing I would say that's really super interesting is what's happening with the Respect for Marriage Act. Who's the biggest opponent, one of the biggest opponents of same-sex marriage, legal same-sex marriage in the world, was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, Catholics and Mormons. Mormon church spent a lot of money fighting it in California. It got a huge backlash against them. What happens in Utah is that LGBTQ Mormons, who are not in ex-Mormons, start talking to church leaders. And they say, and the church leaders go, hey, we're going to lose this on a civic world. And they start building relationships very slowly, tensely. They figure out that they can figure out some ways that they could coexist and work together on other things, non-discrimination. So they come up with the Utah Compromise. And right now, the Senate's about to pass this thing, which is going to codify same-sex marriage with bipartisan support, because the Mormons and church leaders and LGBT activists in their community figured out what they could agree on and how they could work together. So I think there's some, it doesn't solve the internal church program, but it is kind of a model of like, wait, there are things you could do together that you're going to always disagree. I mean, Christians disagree about everything, right? Everything. What you eat, what you call a pastor, who can talk in the church, what songs you can sing, what letters you can put in the words about how you describe what Jesus is, right? Early church was killing each other over one letter, iota, right? Whether Jesus was homoousion or homoousion. There were church wars. They're always going to disagree. It's whatever thing you disagree on is always going to be the next thing. And in this moment, that's a crisis, and it's important, and you should talk about that. But if you make it the existential thing that you allow the world to burn down around you and don't show that you can talk to each other and figure out, maybe you're in different churches and you still can work together on poverty. Nobody likes poverty, right? People want to have better immigration. People want better schools. People agree on so much things. And you have so much to offer about how to deal with difference and say, I still respect you as a person. Because what the world wants to say is, you're on the other team, you're the devil, you're a demon, you're awful, we can never talk to you, we could never work together, you are the problem that makes the world terrible. And what churches have often said is, no, you're all beloved children of God. You're going to squabble, you're going to disagree, but you could do things together across difference and still treat each other with respect. So I think that's the thing. Because human sexuality, it's just never going anywhere. It's never going to disappear. And I think, and if we tell people we hate them, they'll never come. And I've got kids in college and young adults. If churches tell our young people that we hate their gay friends, then they will never want to be part of the church. So there's that kind of thing. Like, it's really important. But don't let the house burn down. Just don't, because that we will all be worse off. Because I love organized religion, and I love the part about institutions are a tool. Tools are important. Buildings like this space is important. Like, organized religion is super important. And people, I don't think you were saying this because you believe in organized religion. You have to organize it well, and you can't organize your way out of stuff. But organized religion is the tool which you use to take your values out in the world and make it work. And there are a lot of folks out there who say, we don't need this stuff. It'd be great if people leave because we don't need organized religion. But a bunch of people getting their nirvana or praying by themselves all in their own houses has nowhere near the kind of power that people working together has. And we could lose all of this, and we could be and there's no way to regain it. Churches do things that what is the word? What do we call people that go to a church? A congregation, because they congregate. And they know each other's names and their numbers. And then they go together and they say, you should make the world a better place. And they send them out, and they all know each other's numbers. And so when something bad happens, who do you call? You call the churches, because they know how to get things done. And the world is relying on all of you to do that. And it's okay to disagree. I'm preaching here now. It's okay to disagree, but don't forget that everyone is depending on you. And you have to be the grown-ups, right? Be the grown-ups and be who you say you are. And being who you say you are means you cannot participate in nonsense. There's no time for that because everyone else is. And when church leaders get up and participate in the nonsense, they're throwing gasoline on the fire. And I'm a reporter going, don't. And I'm not supposed to, right? I don't have any opinions. So now I'm going to get in trouble. But I'm like, don't do that, because that's the stupidest thing you could do in the world is destroy everything because you couldn't agree on this one issue. Just stop, please. Because we need you to do better. And we need someone to be the grown-up and to give the world what you have to offer. So that's my sermon.